Before we dive into this fascinating exploration of alternate history, please take a moment to show your support for our channel. Hit that like button if you enjoy historical documentaries like this one, subscribe to join our growing community of history enthusiasts, and leave a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We love connecting with viewers from around the globe. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you quality historical content. The morning of June the 6th, 1944, dawned grey and turbulent across the English Channel, much like it did in our timeline. However, in this alternate reality, the waves that crashed against the Norman shores would carry a far different story, one of unprecedented American tragedy rather than triumph. The first signs of disaster emerged as the landing craft approached Omaha Beach. Unlike our historical timeline, German intelligence had successfully intercepted crucial details about Operation Overlord's exact timing and locations 3 days prior. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who in our reality was absent from Normandy on June 6th due to his wife's birthday, had instead rushed back to oversee the Atlantic Wall's defenses personally. The concrete fortifications that dotted the Norman coastline, already formidable structures built by the organization TOT since 1942, had been reinforced with additional artillery pieces and machine gun nests in the critical 72 hours before the invasion. The American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions faced a nightmare beyond their worst preparations. The German 352nd Infantry Division, which historically had been only partially positioned at Omaha Beach, was now fully deployed and reinforced with elements of the 21st Panzer Division. As the first wave of American soldiers stormed the beach at 06:30 hours, they encountered not the sporadic resistance they had trained for, but a wall of coordinated fire from positions that should have been neutralized by the preliminary bombardment. The naval bombardment, which in our timeline had been shortened due to concerns about collateral damage to French civilians, had in this reality been even less effective. The German defenders, forewarned and better prepared, had constructed additional camouflage positions that remained intact despite the Allied artillery barrage. When the landing craft ramps dropped, American soldiers found themselves advancing into a killing field where every approach had been precisely calculated and covered by interlocking fields of fire. The tragedy unfolded with mechanical precision. The amphibious tanks, which were supposed to provide crucial fire support, suffered even greater losses than in our historical timeline. Of the 29 D.D. Sherman tanks launched toward Omaha Beach, only one successfully reached the shore intact, compared to the 2 that made it in our reality. The rough seas, combined with more accurate German artillery fire, sent these crucial armored vehicles to the bottom of the channel, taking their crews with them. By 0800 hours, what had been planned as America's primary landing site had become a scene of unprecedented carnage. The first wave of assault troops found themselves pinned down in the shallows and on the narrow beach, unable to advance beyond the seawall. The German machine gun positions at WN-72 and WN-74, which historically had been suppressed by American destroyers moving dangerously close to shore, continued their devastating fire throughout the morning. The USS McCook and USS Carmick, the destroyers that had provided crucial close fire support in our timeline, had been forced to maintain greater distances due to more accurate German coastal artillery, reducing their effectiveness significantly. The heroism of individual American soldiers remained unchanged. Men like General Norman Cota and Colonel Charles Canham still led by example, attempting to rally their troops despite the overwhelming odds. However, their leadership, while inspiring, could not overcome the fundamental tactical disadvantage they faced. The gaps in the wire obstacles that American engineers were supposed to create remained largely intact, and the paths up the bluffs that led inland remained firmly in German hands. As the morning progressed, the communications breakdown that had plagued the historical Omaha landing became even more severe. Radio equipment, soaked by seawater and damaged by German artillery, failed to coordinate the supporting naval fire that might have turned the tide. The situation reports reaching General Omar Bradley aboard the USS Augusta painted an increasingly desperate picture. Unlike our historical timeline, where American forces began gaining footholds on the bluffs by late morning, the defensive positions remained intact and deadly. The human cost mounted with each passing hour. Casualty figures that in our reality had been devastating, approximately 2,400 American casualties at Omaha Beach, climbed to over 4,000 by noon in this alternate timeline. Medical Corps personnel, who had planned to establish aid stations on the beach, found themselves unable to function effectively under the constant German fire. The wounded accumulated in the shallows and behind the limited cover of the seawall, with little hope of evacuation. By 1300 hours, on June 6th, the unthinkable had occurred. General Bradley, faced with casualty reports that exceeded his worst projections and the complete failure to establish any sustainable foothold beyond the beach, made the agonizing decision that Dwight Eisenhower had prepared for but hoped never to issue. The order came down to begin evacuation procedures at Omaha Beach. American forces would withdraw under the cover of naval gunfire, abandoning their objectives and leaving behind equipment, wounded who could not be moved, and the dreams of liberation that had sustained the Allied cause. The reverberations of this decision extended far beyond the Norman coastline. As news of the American withdrawal reached the other landing beaches, where British and Canadian forces had achieved their objectives with relative success, the entire strategic framework of Operation Overlord began to collapse. Without the crucial American sector secured, the broader invasion could not be sustained. The western flank, which was supposed to protect the advance toward Cherbourg and its vital port facilities, remained in German hands. The evacuation itself became another tragedy. German artillery, now free to concentrate on the departing American forces, continued to inflict casualties as landing craft attempted to rescue survivors from the beaches. U-boats, which historically had been less effective against the invasion fleet, managed to sink 2 LSTs loaded with evacuating wounded, adding to the day's toll. The Luftwaffe, which in our timeline had been largely ineffective on D-Day, mounted more coordinated attacks against the retreating fleet, having been better positioned due to the advance warning. As darkness fell on June 6, 1944, the English Channel bore witness to one of the most complete tactical defeats in American military history. The waters between Portsmouth and Normandy carried the remnants of what had been the largest amphibious assault ever attempted. Hospital ships worked through the night, treating wounds that would heal, while the psychological trauma of defeat began its longer, more insidious damage to the survivors. The implications of this catastrophic failure reached far beyond the immediate tactical situation. In Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt faced the most serious military crisis of his presidency. The American public, which had been prepared for casualties but not for outright defeat, reacted with shock and growing demands for accountability. The unity of purpose that had sustained the American war effort since Pearl Harbor faced its greatest test. While across the Atlantic, Adolf Hitler proclaimed the failure of Operation Overlord as vindication of his Atlantic Wall strategy and proof of German invincibility. The failed landing at Omaha Beach had become the fulcrum upon which the entire course of World War II would now turn, setting in motion a chain of events that would reshape not only the remainder of the conflict, but the entire post-war world order. The news of the Omaha Beach disaster reached London in the early hours of June 7, 1944, fundamentally altering the strategic calculations of every major power involved in World War II. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had been awaiting confirmation of the invasion's success, instead found himself confronting the most serious crisis of his wartime leadership. The failure of Operation Overlord represented not merely a tactical setback, but a complete reassessment of Allied capabilities and German defensive strength. In the immediate aftermath, the political ramifications proved as devastating as the military ones. General Dwight Eisenhower, true to the prepared statement he had drafted before the invasion, accepted full responsibility for the operation's failure and submitted his resignation as Supreme Allied Commander. Unlike our historical timeline, where such a statement remained unused, this document became one of the most significant military communications of the war. Eisenhower's departure from the European theater marked the end of his meteoric rise and consequently eliminated any possibility of his future presidency, fundamentally altering the post-war American political landscape. The British response proved equally dramatic. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who had commanded the overall ground forces for Operation Overlord, faced intense scrutiny from Parliament and the British press. While the British and Canadian sectors had achieved their D-Day objectives, the collapse of the American effort had rendered these gains meaningless. The evacuation of all Allied forces from Normandy by June 8th left Montgomery's reputation in ruins, and Churchill's government facing a crisis of confidence that would ultimately lead to significant changes in British war leadership. More immediately consequential was the strategic reorientation that the failure necessitated. The carefully coordinated Allied plan for 1944, which had been built around the assumption of a successful Second Front in Western Europe, collapsed entirely. The combined chiefs of staff found themselves forced to completely reconceptualize their approach to defeating Nazi Germany. The resources that had been allocated for the follow-up operations in France, the breakout from Normandy, the liberation of Paris, and the advance toward the German border now required complete reallocation. The failure's impact on Allied morale extended far beyond the military command structure. Throughout occupied Europe, resistance movements that had been coordinated to support the Normandy landings found themselves exposed and vulnerable. The French resistance, which had launched coordinated sabotage operations throughout northern France in support of Operation Overlord, now faced German reprisals without the protection of advancing Allied armies. The savage response from German security forces, no longer distracted by the immediate threat of invasion, resulted in the destruction of resistance networks that had taken years to develop. Perhaps most critically, the failure of D-Day fundamentally altered the balance of forces on the Eastern Front. In our historical timeline, Operation Bagration, the massive Soviet offensive launched on June 23, 1944, had achieved its devastating success partly because German reserves remained tied down in Western Europe, awaiting potential Allied follow-up invasions. However, with the Western threat apparently neutralized, Adolf Hitler made the fateful decision to reinforce Army Group Center with divisions that had been held in reserve in France. The German High Command's confidence, buoyed by their successful defense of the Atlantic Wall, led to a more aggressive defensive posture in the east. The 12th SS Panzer Division, which historically had been committed to fighting in Normandy, instead found itself rushing eastward to reinforce the sector around Vitebsk and Orsha. Similarly, the Panzer Lehr Division and elements of the 21st Panzer Division, rather than being ground down in the hedgerows of Normandy, were available to contest the Soviet advance through Belorussia. This redeployment had profound implications for Operation Bagration's effectiveness. While the Soviet offensive still achieved significant gains, the Red Army's numerical superiority and tactical improvements developed since Stalingrad could not be entirely negated. The presence of additional German armored reserves slowed the advance considerably. The complete destruction of Army Group Center, which in our timeline had been accomplished in just 3 weeks, instead became a grinding, costly campaign that stretched through the summer of 1944. The strategic consequences extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Stalin, who had coordinated the timing of Operation Bagration with the Western Allies' planned offensive, found his forces facing a reinforced enemy without the expected relief that a second front would have provided. The Soviet leaders' anger at this development created immediate strains in the Grand Alliance that would have far-reaching consequences for post-war planning. Meanwhile, in the Pacific Theater, the failure in Europe began to influence American strategic priorities. General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz found their planned operations receiving increased resources as Washington sought to demonstrate American military capability following the European setback. The acceleration of Pacific operations, particularly the planned invasion of the Philippines and the strategic bombing campaign against Japan, became viewed as essential for maintaining American credibility with both allies and enemies. The German response to their defensive victory proved equally significant in shaping subsequent events. Hitler, whose confidence in the Atlantic Wall's effectiveness had been vindicated, ordered the immediate strengthening of coastal defenses from Norway to Spain. The organization Todt, which had constructed the original fortifications, received unprecedented resources to expand and improve the defensive system. Construction of new bunkers, artillery positions, and obstacle systems accelerated throughout the summer of 1944, making any future invasion attempt exponentially more difficult. Nazi propaganda seized upon the victory with unprecedented fervor. Joseph Goebbels proclaimed June 6, 1944, as the day that proved German invincibility and the futility of Allied hopes for victory. The successful defense was presented not merely as a tactical success, but as evidence of divine favor for the German cause. This propaganda victory proved particularly effective in maintaining civilian morale within Germany, even as Allied strategic bombing continued to devastate German cities. The failure also had unexpected consequences for German industrial planning. The successful defense of the Atlantic Wall convinced Nazi leadership that the war would continue for an extended period, leading to increased emphasis on defensive weapons production rather than offensive capabilities. Resources that might have been allocated to new tank designs or aircraft development instead went toward producing more coastal artillery, anti-tank guns, and fortification materials. In the occupied territories, the German response proved particularly harsh. The successful defense of France led to increased confidence in German ability to maintain control over conquered territories. Deportations to concentration camps accelerated, as German authorities no longer felt the immediate pressure of impending liberation. The Holocaust continued unabated, with tragic consequences that extended far beyond our historical timeline. The economic implications of the failed invasion also began to manifest throughout the summer of 1944. The Lend-Lease program, which had been providing crucial support to the Soviet Union, faced increased scrutiny from the American Congress following the military setback. While support continued, the political will for massive economic aid weakened considerably, affecting Soviet industrial capacity at a critical moment in their campaign against German forces. As the summer of 1944 progressed, it became increasingly clear that the failure at Omaha Beach had fundamentally altered the trajectory of World War II. The careful Allied strategy for defeating Nazi Germany through coordinated pressure from east and west had collapsed, replaced by a more uncertain and potentially longer conflict whose resolution remained far from clear. The failure of Operation Overlord placed an unprecedented burden on the Soviet Union, transforming what had been planned as a coordinated two-front assault on Nazi Germany into a predominantly single-front campaign. By July 1944, it became clear that Stalin's Red Army would bear the primary responsibility for Germany's defeat, a realization that fundamentally altered Soviet strategic planning and had profound implications for the war's progression. Operation Bagration, launched on June 23, 1944, just 17 days after the D-Day disaster, proceeded under vastly different circumstances than originally envisioned. Soviet planning had assumed that German reserves would remain tied down in Western Europe, expecting continued Allied pressure following the Normandy landings. Instead, Marshal Georgy Zhukov and his staff found themselves confronting a German army group center that had been reinforced with divisions originally held in reserve for the Western Front. The Soviet offensive, while still achieving significant tactical successes, encountered unexpected resistance around the fortified cities of Vitebsk, Orsha, and Mogilev. These positions, designated as Festerplatz, or fortified places by German command, had been reinforced with additional artillery and anti-tank weapons transferred from the Atlantic Wall following the successful defense of Normandy. The 12th SS Panzer Division, which in our timeline had been decimated fighting British forces in the Normandy hedgerows, instead found itself deployed near Vitebsk, providing mobile reserves that significantly slowed the Soviet advance. The human cost of this reinforced German resistance proved devastating for the Red Army. While Operation Bagration had historically been characterized by the rapid encirclement and destruction of German forces, the presence of additional armored reserves allowed for more organized German withdrawals. The 4th German Army, which in our timeline had been completely destroyed by June 28th, instead conducted a fighting retreat that preserved significant portions of its strength while inflicting heavy casualties on advancing Soviet forces. Soviet losses during the summer of 1944 mounted to unprecedented levels. The Red Army, which had perfected the tactics of deep battle doctrine throughout 1943, found these methods less effective against reinforced German defenses. The rapid breakthrough and exploitation phases that characterized successful Soviet operations required achieving surprise and overwhelming local superiority. With German reserves available to counterattack breakthrough points, Soviet tank corps found themselves engaged in costly frontal battles rather than the mobile operations they had mastered. The strategic implications extended far beyond immediate battlefield casualties. The failure to achieve the rapid destruction of Army Group Center meant that the planned follow-up operations, the advance to the Baltic Sea, the isolation of Army Group North, and the push toward Warsaw faced significant delays. The carefully coordinated sequence of Soviet offensives planned for 1944, each building upon the success of the previous operation, instead became a series of costly grinding battles that consumed reserves earmarked for future campaigns. Stalin's response to these developments revealed the immense pressure the Soviet leader faced. Intelligence reports reaching Moscow indicated that the Western Allies were reconsidering their strategy for European operations, with some American military leaders advocating for a shift in focus toward the Pacific theater following the Normandy failure. The prospect of bearing the primary burden of defeating Nazi Germany while American resources were diverted to the war against Japan created a strategic nightmare that threatened to prolong the European conflict indefinitely. The Soviet industrial system, already operating at maximum capacity, faced new challenges in supporting an extended single-front campaign. The Lend-Lease program, which had provided crucial support to Soviet logistics and production, came under increased political pressure in the United States following the D-Day disaster. While materials continued to flow through Arctic convoys and the Persian Corridor, the quantities decreased as American public support for European operations waned. This reduction particularly affected Soviet access to high-octane aviation fuel, aluminum for aircraft production, and the trucks that had revolutionized Red Army logistics. The impact on Soviet aviation proved particularly severe. The Red Army Air Force, which had achieved local air superiority over most sectors of the Eastern Front by 1944, found itself facing reinforced Luftwaffe units transferred from Western Europe. German fighter squadrons that had been held in reserve to counter Allied air operations over France instead deployed to support Army Group Center's defense. The resulting air battles consumed aircraft and experienced pilots that the Soviet Union could ill afford to lose. Soviet partisan operations behind German lines also suffered from the changed strategic situation. Partisan units throughout Belarus and Ukraine had coordinated their activities with the expectation that regular Red Army forces would link up with them within weeks of beginning operations. Instead, the slowed Soviet advance left these irregular forces exposed to intensified German anti-partisan campaigns. The Wehrmacht units that might have been withdrawn to defend against Allied operations in France, instead, remained available for rear area security operations, resulting in the destruction of partisan networks that had taken months to establish. The diplomatic implications of bearing the primary burden of defeating Germany created additional complications for Stalin. The Soviet leader had entered 1944 with the expectation that the successful opening of a second front would provide leverage in post-war planning discussions with Britain and the United States. The failure of Operation Overlord instead placed the Soviet Union in the position of requiring continued Western support while carrying the heaviest burden of the fighting. This dynamic complicated negotiations over post-war territorial arrangements and spheres of influence. By August 1944, the cumulative effects of fighting a reinforced German army without Western relief had created a crisis within Soviet high command. The Red Army's advance, while continuing, had slowed to a pace that threatened to extend the war well into 1945 or even 1946. Soviet casualty figures for the summer offensive approached 2 million killed, wounded, and missing, losses that far exceeded even the worst projections made during the campaign's planning phases. The morale impact on Soviet forces proved equally significant. Red Army soldiers and officers had entered the 1944 campaign season with the expectation that victory was within reach. The knowledge that Western allies had failed in their invasion attempt, combined with the increasingly costly nature of their own advance, began to affect the fighting spirit that had sustained Soviet forces through the darkest periods of the war. Reports from political officers indicated growing war weariness among troops who had believed that the end of the conflict was imminent. Stalin's personal response to these developments reflected the enormous pressure he faced. Soviet archives from this period reveal a leader increasingly frustrated with his Western allies and concerned about his nation's ability to sustain the massive casualty rates required to defeat Germany single-handedly. The Premier's meetings with his military commanders became increasingly tense as he demanded more rapid advances, while simultaneously recognizing the limited resources available to achieve such objectives. The failure of the Western allies to establish and maintain a second front had transformed the character of the Eastern Front from a coordinated Allied effort into a primarily Soviet struggle for survival and victory. This shift would have profound implications not only for the immediate course of military operations, but for the post-war balance of power in Europe and the world. The successful defense of Fortress Europe against Operation Overlord marked a pivotal transformation in Nazi Germany's strategic position and military doctrine. What had begun as a desperate attempt to prevent a two-front war had evolved into a vindication of defensive warfare that profoundly influenced German planning for the remainder of World War II. The triumph of the Atlantic Wall represented more than a tactical victory. It demonstrated the potential effectiveness of coordinated defensive systems and fundamentally altered German confidence in their ability to achieve ultimate victory. Adolf Hitler's response to the successful defense revealed both the strategic opportunities and dangerous overconfidence that the victory created. The Führer, who had personally insisted on the construction of the Atlantic Wall despite skepticism from some military commanders, proclaimed June 6, 1944, as vindication of his strategic vision. His directive, issued on June 10, 1944, ordered the immediate expansion and strengthening of coastal defenses from the Arctic Ocean to the Spanish border, allocating resources on a scale that rivaled the original construction program. The organization taught the military construction company responsible for building the original Atlantic Wall received unprecedented authority and resources to expand the defensive system. Under the direction of Albert Speer, now serving as both armaments minister and head of the expanded fortification program, construction crews worked around the clock to strengthen existing positions and build new defensive lines. The successful defense had demonstrated that properly constructed and manned fortifications could defeat even the most massive amphibious assault, leading to a fundamental shift in German strategic thinking. The architectural evolution of the Atlantic Wall, following the D-Day repulse, reflected both improved engineering techniques and lessons learned from the battle itself. German engineers analyzed every aspect of the Allied assault, identifying weaknesses in their defensive design while recognizing the elements that had proven most effective. The result was a new generation of fortifications that incorporated deeper bunker systems, improved fields of fire, and enhanced protection against naval bombardment. Construction of the expanded Atlantic Wall required massive resources that had previously been allocated to offensive operations. Tank production, which had been emphasized for Eastern Front operations, was redirected toward manufacturing the specialized equipment needed for coastal defense. The famous German 88mm anti-aircraft guns found new roles as anti-ship weapons, while new designs specifically intended for fortress warfare entered production. This shift from offensive to defensive military production had profound implications for Germany's ability to conduct mobile operations on other fronts. The psychological impact of the successful defense extended far beyond military circles. German civilian morale, which had been steadily declining due to Allied bombing campaigns and news from the Eastern Front, received an enormous boost from the victory in Normandy. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine presented the defense as proof of German invincibility and the futility of Allied hopes for victory. Newsreels showing American casualties on Omaha Beach and captured Allied equipment became powerful tools for maintaining domestic support for continued resistance. The success also influenced German diplomatic efforts with neutral nations and potential allies. Spain, which had maintained precarious neutrality throughout the war, found itself under renewed pressure to join the Axis following the demonstration of German defensive capability. Similarly, Turkey and other neutral nations reconsidered their positions as the successful defense suggested that Germany might yet achieve victory, or at least negotiate a favorable peace settlement. Within the German military establishment, the successful defense created new debates about strategic priorities and resource allocation. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group West, advocated for further strengthening of coastal defenses while maintaining sufficient reserves for counterattacks. However, other commanders argued that the victory presented an opportunity to transfer divisions eastward to achieve decisive success against the Soviet Union before the Western Allies could mount another invasion attempt. The technological implications of the successful defense also influenced German research and development priorities. The effectiveness of coordinated artillery fire, demonstrated during the Omaha Beach engagement, led to increased emphasis on improving fire control systems and communication networks. Similarly, the role of obstacles and mines in channeling Allied assault forces into predetermined killing zones resulted in expanded production of defensive munitions and barrier systems. German naval strategy underwent significant revision following the successful repulse of Operation Overlord. The Kriegsmarine, which had been reduced to primarily submarine operations by 1944, found new relevance in coastal defense roles. Plans developed throughout the summer of 1944 called for the construction of new coastal artillery batteries and the deployment of remaining surface vessels as floating gun platforms to support fixed fortifications. The success of the Atlantic Wall also influenced German planning for potential defensive operations in other theaters. The lessons learned from the Normandy defense were applied to strengthening fortifications in Italy, the Balkans, and even the Eastern Front. The concept of defensive zones backed by mobile reserves became a central element of German strategic planning, replacing the purely offensive doctrine that had characterized earlier phases of the war. However, the emphasis on defensive operations also created significant strategic vulnerabilities. The massive resources devoted to fortification construction were no longer available for mobile operations or the production of advanced weapons systems. German tank production, which had been crucial for Eastern Front operations, declined as industrial capacity was redirected toward producing coastal artillery and fortification materials. This shift would have significant implications for Germany's ability to conduct effective operations against the advancing Red Army. The human cost of maintaining the expanded Atlantic Wall proved equally significant. The successful defense required substantial garrison forces that were no longer available for operations on other fronts. Divisions that might have been transferred to reinforce Army Group Center or Army Group South instead remained tied to coastal defense duties, reducing German flexibility in responding to Soviet offensive operations. Despite these challenges, the immediate aftermath of the successful D-Day defense created a period of strategic optimism within German leadership that had been absent since the early victories of 1941 and 1942. The demonstration that Allied amphibious capabilities could be defeated encouraged German leaders to believe that the war might yet be won through defensive operations, combined with the new weapon systems under development, including jet aircraft and ballistic missiles. The transformation of the Atlantic Wall from a desperate defensive measure into a symbol of German resistance would continue to influence military operations and strategic planning throughout the remainder of 1944, creating both opportunities and constraints that would shape the final phases of World War II in ways that deviated dramatically from our historical timeline. By the autumn of 1944, the failure of Operation Overlord had created a fundamentally different trajectory for World War II, extending the conflict well beyond its historical conclusion and reshaping the post-war global order in unprecedented ways. The prolonged European war created a complex web of consequences that affected not only the immediate military situation, but also the political, economic, and social structures that would define the remainder of the 20th century. The most immediate consequence of the extended conflict was the continued suffering of occupied populations throughout Europe. The Holocaust, which in our historical timeline had been interrupted by advancing Allied armies in 1944 and 1945, continued unabated in this alternate reality. The Nazi extermination program, no longer facing the immediate threat of liberation, proceeded with systematic efficiency that resulted in casualties far exceeding our historical record. Jewish communities in Hungary, Romania, and other areas that had been saved by rapid Allied advances instead faced complete destruction as German resources remained available for genocidal operations. Soviet casualties mounted to unprecedented levels as the Red Army bore the primary burden of defeating Nazi Germany without effective Western support. By December 1944, Soviet military losses had exceeded 15 million killed, wounded, and missing, figures that dwarfed even the catastrophic casualties of the historical Eastern Front. The human cost created social and economic disruptions within the Soviet Union that would influence post-war reconstruction for decades. Entire age cohorts were decimated, creating demographic imbalances that affected Soviet society long after the war's conclusion. The extended duration of the European conflict had profound implications for the war in the Pacific theater. American resources, which historically had been divided between European and Pacific operations, were increasingly concentrated against Japan following the D-Day failure. This resource shift accelerated the development and production of strategic bombers, naval vessels, and ultimately the atomic weapons program. The Manhattan Project, given higher priority due to the European stalemate, achieved successful weapons production by early 1945, several months ahead of the historical timeline. The political ramifications within the Allied nations proved equally significant. In the United States, the failure of Operation Overlord created a crisis of confidence in military leadership that influenced the 1944 presidential election. President Franklin Roosevelt, facing criticism for the military disaster, found his support significantly weakened. The election, which historically had been a comfortable victory for Roosevelt, instead became a closely contested campaign that resulted in Thomas Dewey winning the presidency. This change in American leadership fundamentally altered post-war diplomatic relations and Reconstruction policies. Great Britain faced even more severe political upheaval. Winston Churchill, whose wartime leadership had been vindicated by eventual victory in our timeline, instead found his position increasingly precarious as the war dragged into 1945. The enormous cost of the extended conflict, combined with the failure to achieve decisive results, led to growing calls for a negotiated peace. Parliamentary debates throughout late 1944 revealed deep divisions within the British government about continuing the war effort, ultimately resulting in Churchill's removal from office in early 1945 and his replacement by a government more amenable to peace negotiations. The economic consequences of the prolonged conflict proved devastating for all participants. The German economy, which had been sustained by captured resources and slave labor, began showing signs of severe strain by early 1945. The massive resources devoted to constructing and maintaining the expanded Atlantic Wall, combined with the continued demands of the Eastern Front, created shortages that affected both military operations and civilian populations. Industrial production declined as raw materials became increasingly scarce, limiting Germany's ability to replace military equipment and maintain defensive positions. For the Soviet Union, the extended single-front war created economic challenges that threatened the viability of continued operations. The Lend-Lease program, which had provided crucial industrial and logistical support, faced increasing political opposition in the United States following the D-Day failure. Reduced American aid, combined with the enormous consumption of resources required for offensive operations against reinforced German positions, strained Soviet industrial capacity to its limits. By mid-1945, shortages of fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment began affecting Red Army operational capabilities. The prolonged conflict also influenced the development and deployment of new weapons technologies. German research programs, given additional time due to the successful defense of Western Europe, achieved breakthroughs in jet aircraft and missile technology that began affecting military operations by late 1944. The Me-262 jet fighter, deployed in larger numbers than in our historical timeline, achieved local air superiority over certain sectors of the Eastern Front. Similarly, V-2 missile attacks against Soviet supply lines and staging areas created new challenges for Red Army logistics. The atomic weapons program took on new significance as the war extended into 1945. The United States, faced with the prospect of an indefinite conventional war in Europe, accelerated nuclear weapons development while simultaneously considering their use against German targets. The moral and strategic implications of employing atomic weapons against European cities created intense debates within the American government that would have influenced post-war international relations regardless of the ultimate decision. International relationships underwent fundamental changes as the extended conflict continued. The Grand Alliance between Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, which had been maintained through the expectation of eventual victory, began showing serious strains as the war dragged on without resolution. Stalin's increasing frustration with Western military failures led to independent peace negotiations with German representatives, creating the possibility of a separate peace that would have fundamentally altered the global balance of power. Neutral nations found their positions increasingly untenable as the extended conflict created pressure for choosing sides. Spain, Turkey, and Sweden faced growing demands to either join the Axis powers or provide increased support to the Allies. The successful German defense of Western Europe encouraged some neutrals to consider that supporting Germany might be the safer long-term strategy, potentially creating a cascade of diplomatic realignments that would have reshaped European politics. The humanitarian crisis created by the extended war reached proportions that exceeded even the catastrophic suffering of the historical conflict. Refugee populations throughout Europe, unable to return to liberated territories due to continued German occupation, faced additional years of displacement and deprivation. Medical and food supplies, already severely strained, became increasingly inadequate as the war consumed resources needed for basic humanitarian support. By the spring of 1945, nearly a year after the historical end of the European War, the continued conflict had created a world fundamentally different from our historical timeline. The failure of Operation Overlord had not simply delayed victory, it had created an alternative trajectory that affected every aspect of international relations, economic development, and social progress. The consequences of that grey morning on Omaha Beach would continue to influence world history for generations to come, creating a post-war order shaped by prolonged conflict rather than decisive Allied victory. The extended European war had demonstrated that the failure of a single military operation could reshape the entire course of world history, creating consequences that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield to influence the fundamental structures of international relations and human civilization. As we conclude this exploration of alternative history, we must confront the profound implications of how a single day's events could have reshaped the entire trajectory of human civilization. The failure of Operation Overlord on June 6, 1944, represents more than just a military what-if. It reveals the fragile nature of historical progress and the enormous consequences that can flow from seemingly inevitable events taking a different course. The world that emerged from this prolonged conflict would have been fundamentally different from the one we know. The extended war created casualties that dwarfed even the catastrophic losses of our historical timeline, particularly among Soviet forces who bore the primary burden of defeating Nazi Germany. The demographic impact of these losses would have influenced economic development, social progress, and political evolution throughout Eastern Europe for generations. Entire communities that survived in our timeline were lost, while the intellectual and cultural contributions of those who perished represent incalculable losses to human civilization. The political ramifications extended far beyond the immediate participants. The change in American leadership, with Thomas Dewey assuming the presidency instead of Franklin Roosevelt serving a fourth term, fundamentally altered the approach to post-war reconstruction and international organization. The United Nations, if it emerged at all, would have taken a very different form without Roosevelt's vision and Stalin's cooperation. The economic systems that defined the post-war era, the Bretton Woods Agreement, the Marshall Plan, and the development of international trade organizations would have evolved along entirely different lines. Perhaps most significantly, the extended European conflict delayed or prevented many of the social and technological advances that characterized the post-war period. Medical advances achieved through wartime research, the acceleration of women's participation in the workforce, and the beginning of decolonization movements throughout the developing world, all followed different trajectories in this alternate timeline. The civil rights movement in the United States, influenced by African American military service and the moral clarity gained from defeating fascism, would have developed under vastly different circumstances. The technological implications prove equally profound. The extended war accelerated certain developments, particularly in aerospace and nuclear technology, while delaying others. The computer revolution, which grew from wartime advances in cryptography and calculation, might have been delayed by decades. Similarly, the medical advances that emerged from treating massive casualties continued longer, potentially leading to earlier breakthroughs in surgery, rehabilitation, and mental health treatment. The moral landscape of the post-war world would have been irrevocably altered. The complete revelation of the Holocaust, which in our timeline provided moral clarity about the necessity of the war, would have been accompanied by the knowledge that the Western allies had failed in their attempts at rescue. The guilt and responsibility felt by survivors would have been compounded by the extended suffering of those who might have been saved. This moral burden would have influenced international law, human rights development, and the response to future genocides in ways we can only imagine. The geopolitical order that emerged would have featured a Soviet Union that had borne the primary cost of defeating fascism, creating a very different dynamic in post-war negotiations. Stalin's position as the leader who had achieved victory through Soviet sacrifice alone would have provided enormous leverage in determining European reconstruction. The Iron Curtain, if it descended at all, might have fallen much further west, potentially including France and other Western European nations within the Soviet sphere of influence. The Cold War itself would have taken fundamentally different forms. An America that had failed in its primary military endeavor against Nazi Germany would have approached post-war competition with reduced confidence and altered strategies. The nuclear monopoly, if it had been achieved, would have been balanced against the reality of conventional military failure. The dynamics of deterrence, alliance formation, and proxy conflicts would have evolved along entirely different lines. Economic development throughout the world would have followed alternative paths. The American industrial expansion that characterized the post-war boom was built upon successful wartime production and the confidence gained from victory. Extended conflict would have created different industrial structures, labor relations, and international trade patterns. The dollar's role as the international reserve currency, the development of multinational corporations, and the growth of consumer capitalism would all have been affected by this altered historical trajectory. The cultural and intellectual impact cannot be overstated. The literature, art, and philosophy that emerged from the experience of World War II were profoundly shaped by the nature of Allied victory and the revelation of Nazi crimes. An extended conflict with different outcomes would have produced entirely different cultural responses. The novels, films, and artistic movements that defined post-war culture would have taken forms we cannot imagine, created by survivors of different experiences and shaped by alternative moral landscapes. Educational systems and academic disciplines would have evolved differently as well. The area studies programs that emerged from wartime intelligence needs, the emphasis on international relations and comparative government, and the development of interdisciplinary social sciences were all influenced by the specific character of the war and its aftermath. Alternative outcomes would have created different academic priorities and intellectual frameworks for understanding human behavior and social organization. As we reflect on this alternative history, we gain deeper appreciation for the complexity of historical causation and the profound consequences of events we often take for granted. The success of Operation Overlord was not inevitable. It required countless individual acts of courage, precise coordination of massive resources, and favorable circumstances that could easily have developed differently. Understanding how different outcomes might have unfolded helps us better appreciate both the achievements of those who served and the continuing importance of the values for which they fought. The history we never saw reminds us that progress is not inevitable, that democracy and human rights require constant defense, and that the freedom we often take for granted was purchased at enormous cost by those who came before us. In contemplating what might have been, we gain renewed appreciation for what actually was achieved, and continuing responsibility for preserving and extending the advances in human dignity and international cooperation that emerged from even the darkest periods of human history. The failed D-Day scenario ultimately demonstrates that individual moments of choice and circumstance can reshape the entire trajectory of human civilization, making each generation responsible for the world they leave to their successors and highlighting the continuing relevance of the values and principles for which so many gave their lives during humanity's greatest conflict.